The waters of Lake Erie churned under a sky darkened by an unnatural fog. The year was 1825, and the town of Erie, young and ambitious, had begun to carve its name into the annals of maritime trade. But something in the lake had changed. Ships, the town's very lifeblood, were being found wrecked in different parts of the lake, their crews missing or worse discovered days later, bodies bloated and twisted in expressions of pure terror. The first to disappear had been the Evangeline, a sturdy schooner known for its reliability even in the most unforgiving storms. When it failed to arrive in Buffalo, search parties were sent out. Days passed before the wreckage was found along the shore, its hull shattered as if something had crushed it from below. There were no bodies aboard, only the scattered belongings of the crew, eerily untouched. The rumors spread faster than the morning fog. Some said it was a beast, something ancient and hungry. Others whispered of lights on the water, glowing like lanterns only to disappear when approached. A few of the older fishermen, men who had spent their entire lives on the lake, spoke in hushed tones of shadows beneath the surface, dark shapes that moved against the currents, watching. By the time the third ship was found, the town had changed. Fishermen refused to go out after dusk. The lighthouse keeper, an old man who had seen many storms but never feared the lake, started locking himself inside at night. Even the town's stray dogs would whimper and refuse to go near the docks once the sun set. Then came the storm. It wasn't a natural storm. No wind heralded its arrival, no shift in the air warned of its coming. It simply was, appearing as suddenly as a nightmare that grips the mind in the middle of sleep. The waves rose like walls of black water, and the town was thrown into chaos. Men ran to secure their boats, their desperate efforts drowned out by the deafening roar of something more than thunder. The fog thickened, rolling in heavy and suffocating, blinding those who tried to flee. From the shoreline, the silhouettes of ships appeared, ships that should not have been there. Their sails hung in tatters, their hulls waterlogged and rotting. And yet, they moved, cutting through the water as if guided by unseen hands. The screams came next. Not from the town, but from the lake. The sound carried across the water, distant yet piercing. It was not the scream of drowning men, it was something else, something that no human throat could produce. It rose and fell in an agonized wail, an unholy lamentation that set the teeth on edge and the heart to pounding. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm ceased. The fog lingered for a moment longer, then peeled away, revealing the town of Erie in an eerie stillness. The sky had cleared, the stars twinkling innocently above as if nothing had happened. But something had. The next morning, the townspeople gathered at the docks, staring at what the lake had left behind. An old fishing boat, the Morning Star, had returned, though no one had seen it leave. The deck was covered in a thin layer of frost, despite the summer warmth. The mast had been snapped, as if something had tried to drag it down into the depths. And then there were the footprints. Wet, inhuman footprints leading away from the ship, vanishing into the town. Something had come ashore. And it was not alone. The beast had always been there. Long before the settlers built their wooden homes along the shoreline, long before the Iroquois and Erie tribes whispered of the dark things that lived beneath the waves, it had lurked. Watching. Waiting. It was patient. It had seen the world change above it. It had seen men come and go, fighting their wars, hunting their prey, carving into the land with iron and fire. For centuries, it had been content to stay below, where the water turned black and the light never reached. But now they were pushing too far. The wrecks were only the beginning. The lake had been warning them, giving them a chance to turn back. But they did not listen. More ships came. More men walked the docks at night, their laughter and voices carrying over the water, oblivious to the thing that watched from the depths. It was a cold night when the next ship fell. The Lady Providence was a proud vessel, a merchant ship bound for Detroit, carrying a cargo of timber and grain. She had sailed these waters before, her captain confident in his knowledge of the lake. But knowledge meant nothing to the beast. The attack came in silence. The night watch, a boy no older than 16, was the first to die. He had leaned over the side, peering into the water, swearing he had seen something move beneath the surface. A ripple. A shadow. Then, without a sound, he was gone. The water barely stirred. Then came the impact. A great force struck the ship from below, sending men tumbling across the deck. The wood groaned, cracking like brittle bone. A second strike, harder this time, and the hull splintered. The crew scrambled to their stations, but it was already too late. The beast was not just attacking. It was pulling. Ropes snapped. Barrels rolled. The mast shuddered as if struck by a hurricane wind. And then, from the depths, something rose. The men who saw it did not live to tell of it. A shape, impossibly large, its skin glistening like whetstone in the moonlight. Eyes, too many eyes glowed from the abyss. Limbs, long and gnarled, tipped with jagged hooks, wrapped around the ship's belly. The crew screamed as the thing tore through the deck, its movements unnaturally smooth, as though the water obeyed its will. The Lady Providence did not sink. She was dragged down. By dawn, nothing remained but shattered timbers and floating debris. No bodies were found. Only the ship's bell washed ashore, its bronze frame twisted and warped as if melted by something beyond human understanding. The town of Erie awoke to whispers. Another lost ship. Another empty graveyard beneath the lake. But this time, the warnings were not ignored. Fishermen refused to sail. Merchants delayed their voyages. The dock workers refused to step onto the piers at night. And the lighthouse keeper who had spent 50 years watching over the water packed his things and left without a word. The lake was reclaiming its territory. But humanity would not stop. The town was growing, and the lake was its lifeline. New ships were being built. New men were coming, drawn by the promise of trade and fortune. The beast watched. It was patient. But soon, it would have no choice. Soon, it would have to remind them who truly ruled these waters. The years passed, and the lake ran red. At first, they thought it was bad luck. A storm here, a miscalculation there. Ships lost, crews never found. Erie grew despite the warnings, its people pushing further, building bigger ships, digging deeper into the lake's secrets. But the deeper they dug, the angrier it became. There was no reasoning with it. No bargaining. No mercy. The beast had no care for mankind. The disappearances became more violent. Ships found with their decks coated in blood, but not a single body aboard. Hulls caved inward, as if something had crushed them like an eggshell. The town began to lose count of the names, the sons and fathers, the husbands and brothers who set sail and never returned. The newspapers called it the curse of Lake Erie. The sailors called it hunger. By 1842, the beast had taken nearly 50 vessels. No one could deny it anymore. Captains whispered of shadows in the fog, of shapes moving just beneath the surface, of a darkness that lingered even when the sun was bright in the sky. The lighthouse keepers swore they saw ships vanish from their view, their lanterns snuffed out as if swallowed whole. And then came the Lucille. She was a whaling ship, sturdy and proud, her captain a man who feared no storm. He had heard the tales, laughed at the warnings, and sailed out with a crew of 35 men. "We will return by week's end," he had promised the town. "And we will bring proof that the lake is nothing more than water and waves." The Lucille returned 3 days later. Drifting. Empty. She glided into the harbor like a ghost, her sails in tatters, her deck littered with tools and weapons left behind in what looked like sheer panic. The anchor was gone. The lifeboats were still secured, untouched. There was no sign of the crew. No sign of a struggle. Only the silence. And one final horror. Scrawled across the main mast, in something dark and sticky, were 3 simple words. "It comes now." No one claimed the ship. No one touched her. The town council had her towed back out to sea and set ablaze. The fire burned long into the night, the embers reflecting on the black surface of the water. But fire meant nothing to it. The next morning, another ship was missing. The beast was no longer warning them. It was hunting. 1847, the Mary Celeste of Erie. The Bellwether, a simple trading vessel, set sail from Erie bound for Cleveland with a crew of 12. She was a modest ship, neither too big nor too bold. The night was calm, the moon high in the sky, and the lake lay still as glass. She was found 2 weeks later, drifting near the Canadian shoreline. Like the Lucille, she was empty. But unlike the Lucille, she was not untouched. The wood of the hull had been split not from the outside, but from within. As if something had burst through the planks. The masts were snapped, their splinters crusted with something black. The captain's log was still in its place, its final entry a scrawl of panicked words. Below us. Below us. Below us. Too many eyes. No light. No hope. Not a single body was ever found. 1863, the ironclad incident. War raged in the country, but the lake had its own battles to fight. The USS Michigan, the first iron-hulled warship of the Great Lakes, was patrolling the waters, a show of force against Confederate spies rumored to be lurking in Canada. She was powerful, a true beast of metal and gunpowder, and her crew of nearly 200 men feared nothing. One night, while anchored near Erie, the sentries reported hearing knocking from beneath the ship. Not the shifting of the hull, nor the groaning of the waves, but deliberate, calculated knocking. As if something below was testing the metal. The next morning, the crew awoke to find deep, jagged scrapes along the underside of the ship. No man-made tool could have done it. The grooves were uneven, crude, yet deliberate. Claw marks. A warning. The Michigan left Erie immediately and never returned to those waters after dark. 1879, the Elizabeth Dane and the Red Fog. The Elizabeth Dane was a passenger ferry, making her nightly route between Erie and Port Dover. That evening, the air was thick with fog, red fog, like blood mixed with mist. The crew blamed the setting sun, said it was just a trick of the light. Then came the lights. Glowing orbs hovering above the water, drifting close to the ship, pulsing like living things. Passengers gathered at the rails, whispering in awe and terror. The lights danced, circled, and then, without warning, rushed forward. The first screams rang out as something emerged from the fog. The Elizabeth Dane arrived at port with half her passengers missing. The survivors were soaked, their clothes clinging to them as if they had been dragged through the water. Some bore bruises in the shape of long, curling fingers. None of them could explain what had happened. None of them could remember. The ferry was scrapped the following year. 1900, the massacre of Fisherman's Cove. It was a quiet night in August, just before the turn of the century. 5 fishing boats left the harbor, bound for deep waters. The men aboard were seasoned sailors, men who had grown up hearing the stories but had laughed them off as superstition. Only one boat returned. And the men aboard? They were not the same. Their eyes were wide, unblinking. Their skin pale, as if they had been left out in the cold for too long. They spoke in hoarse whispers, repeating the same words over and over. The deep. The deep. The deep took them. The others were never found. The surviving fishermen never set sail again. 1914, the lost families of the Erie crossing. The summer air was thick and humid. Families crowded the docks, waiting to board the Marietta, a steam ferry bound for Canada. It was meant to be a peaceful crossing, a journey under the warmth of the stars, with gentle waves lapping at the hull. The children played along the pier. The men smoked their pipes, speaking of war in Europe. The women fanned themselves and spoke of the future. They never saw the fog roll in. Thick, choking, suffocating. It blanketed the dock, swallowing the lantern light, muting the laughter, silencing the world. The water turned still. Then came the sound. A low, guttural groan from beneath the pier. A sound that was not the wind, nor the waves, nor any creature known to man. The first splash was small, a single child, reaching too far over the edge, vanishing before his mother could even scream. The second was larger, a man, his pipe still smoldering as he was pulled backward, his shadow fading into the mist. Then, all at once, the chaos began. Hands, black and glistening, rose from the depths. Long fingers wrapped around ankles and wrists, pulling. The fog swirled as silhouettes struggled, some fighting, some already gone. The lanterns flickered and fell into the water, their flames extinguished with an eerie hiss. By the time the fog cleared, the Marietta was gone. So were the families. All of them. Not a single trace remained. Only the water, still as death. The town of Erie never stopped. No matter how many were taken, no matter how many wrecks washed ashore, the town had to move forward. The lake was their lifeline. It had to be. There was no other choice. But the lake did not forget. And the thing within it did not forgive. For every ship that launched, another sank. For every fisherman who cast his nets, another never came home. The town, despite its best efforts, never grew. It simply maintained. A revolving door of souls. Men arrived in search of work deck hands, dock workers, carpenters, merchants. They filled the gaps left behind by those who had been swallowed whole. But they never stayed. Those who lasted more than a few years left of their own accord, their eyes hollowed, their faces lined with the weight of what they had seen. The others. They left another way. They left in the water. Some went mad. The longer they stayed, the more they saw shadows that shouldn't be there, reflections that moved when they did not. They spoke of voices carried on the wind, whispers rising from beneath the docks. Some claimed to see things in the waves, staring back at them from just below the surface. And then there were the ones who simply walked into the lake. No one stopped them. No one could. They would stare for hours, unmoving, as if entranced. Then, in the dead of night, without a word, they would step off the docks and wade into the water, their bodies vanishing beneath the surface without a single struggle. By morning, they were gone. No ripples. No bubbles. No bodies. Just gone. The town adapted, as humans always do. They stopped looking out over the water after dark. The docks emptied at sunset. Those who worked the ships tied small charms around their wrists, rosaries, bones of small animals, trinkets from their mothers, anything to ward off whatever watched from the deep. But none of it mattered. The lake still took what it wanted. And the thing within it was patient. Every few years, something worse happened. A ship found split in half, its cargo untouched, its crew nowhere to be seen. A lighthouse keeper vanishing in the night, his logbook open to an unfinished entry. It is watching me. The fog is moving wrong. I see. A child, found on the shore at dawn, soaked to the bone, whispering the same words over and over. I heard it calling my name. And still, the town remained. People left. Others arrived. The population never grew, only replaced itself. A town locked in a cycle. A town that refused to leave, no matter how loudly the lake screamed for them to go. And the beast? It never tired. It never stopped. It had been there before the town. It would be there long after. And as long as they remained, it would never stop fighting back. The late 80s brought change to Erie. The stories of shipwrecks, vanishing fishermen, and bloodied waters had once been whispered warnings, but in an age of neon lights and camcorders, they became entertainment. What was once a curse became a gimmick. The lake was rebranded. Tourism campaigns painted Erie as the Loch Ness of the Midwest, a place where the supernatural might just be real. Hotels adopted nautical themes. Souvenir shops lined the docks, selling cheap trinkets, plastic replicas of shipwrecks, T-shirts with slogans like "I survived the Erie abyss," and postcards depicting monstrous silhouettes beneath the waves. The thing became a local legend, a tourist attraction. Boats full of sightseers took nightly ghost voyages, led by guides who laughed as they pointed out spots where ships had gone missing. They told half-truths, distorting the real horrors into stories safe enough for visitors to enjoy. Local businessmen saw profit, but the old fishermen, those who had spent their lives on the lake, saw a mistake. They still remembered the wrecks. They still heard the voices on the wind. They still knew. They warned. No one listened. Then the bodies started washing up again. 1989, the college kids. The first real incident happened in September. A group of students from Penn State had rented a boat for a drunken dare: find the Erie beast or bust. They never came back. The next morning, pieces of their boat washed up on the shore. The wood was shredded, not broken. One survivor was found clinging to a life preserver, half mad with terror. He babbled nonsense until the day he died in a psychiatric ward. But there was one thing he said, one thing he screamed, over and over, even as they sedated him. We saw the lights. We saw the lights. They weren't boats, they weren't boats. 1996, the documentary crew. In the summer of '96, a small TV crew came to Erie to film unsolved American mysteries. They wanted footage, interviews, anything that could make the lake's legend pop. They got more than they bargained for. On their third night of filming, their lead cameraman vanished. He had been standing on the dock, aiming his lens over the water. The last footage recovered from his camera showed something rising from the blackness, a shape too big to be a fish, too fluid to be a machine. And then, the camera dropped. They never found his body. The network buried the footage, calling it an accident. Locals called it a message. The tourists kept coming. 2003, the 4th of July massacre. The town's biggest mistake came in 2003. They wanted something huge, something that would put Erie on the map permanently. So, they launched the Lake Erie Monster Festival, a 3-day event celebrating the legend. There were themed boat rides, lakefront concerts, fireworks shows over the water. Thousands of people flooded the town. And on the second night, the thing finally had enough. The fog rolled in at dusk, thicker, heavier than anyone had ever seen. People laughed at first. How fitting. What an atmosphere. Then the lights began appearing on the water. Dozens. Hundreds. Floating just offshore, bobbing like lanterns on invisible strings. Boats that had been anchored for the night started moving. No engines. No oars. Just drifting. Then the screaming started. The docks collapsed, as if something below had yanked them down. People fell, whole families, straight into the water. Some resurfaced. Some did not. The ones that made it back to land clawed at their own skin, babbling about hands cold, wet hands dragging them down. The fireworks went off as planned, lighting up the sky. And in the brief flashes of red and gold, the people on shore saw something massive moving beneath the water. The news report said 15 dead, 50 missing. Locals knew better. It was more. Much more. 2011, the last warning. By the 2010s, technology had made the lake's legend global. Drones. Sonar scans. Online forums dedicated to finding the Erie Leviathan. More boats. More idiots trying to film something they could barely comprehend. The town grew richer. The lake grew angrier. And in June of 2011, the beast sent its final warning. A private yacht carrying 10 passengers was found floating, untouched, in the middle of the lake. No damage. No wreckage. No sign of struggle. But it was empty. The engines still ran. The radios still worked. The lifeboats were still tied down. And on the deck, burned into the wood as if carved by fire, were 3 words. Leave me be. The tourism didn't stop. The parties continued. The boats kept coming. And deep below, in the cold black waters of the lake, it watched. It waited. It was tired. And soon, it would no longer be ignored. The night was warm, the kind of humid July air that clung to the skin like an extra layer. The lake stretched out before them, an endless void of black water that barely reflected the sliver of a crescent moon above. The only lights came from the bonfire, flickering shadows across the sand, and the distant glow of Erie's shoreline, where bars and street lights pulsed with life. No one worried about the lake. Not yet. There were about 12 of them in total, gathered along the beach where the town's restless youth always found themselves on nights like this. Some sat on coolers, others sprawled out on blankets, passing around cheap beer stolen from older siblings and half-smoked cigarettes that made the younger ones cough and pretend they were fine. There was no real plan. There never was. Just a night away from home. A night to forget that Erie was a dead-end town where dreams drowned faster than people did. A night to be reckless. "Johnny, don't be a little bitch," someone laughed, shoving a half-warm can of beer into his hands. Johnny Vanduke scowled but took a swig anyway. It tasted awful like skunk piss, but he didn't flinch. He never did. That was part of why they kept him around, even though he was barely 13 and had no business hanging out with 17-year-olds. Most of them thought he was annoying as hell. But there was something about him. Something feral. Johnny wasn't like the other kids his age. He had no siblings dragging him home, no parents waiting up for him, no one to tell him no. That made him dangerous in a way that even the older ones couldn't quite place. They didn't trust him, but they liked him. He grinned, wiping his mouth. "Tastes like shit." "You are shit," barked Logan, the self-appointed leader of the group. Tall, broad-shouldered, already working a construction job that he swore was gonna get him out of Erie one day. He was the kind of guy who should have been the town's golden boy football star, decent grades, the whole package. But Erie didn't make golden boys. It made people like Logan. Bitter. Stuck. Full of fists and nowhere to throw them. The music blared from someone's speaker, a warped punk song crackling over the static. A few of the girls were laughing, half drunk already, chasing each other along the shoreline where the waves lapped at their feet. One of them tripped, shrieking, "Something just touched my leg." Her friends screamed in mock horror, running back to the bonfire like children. Logan rolled his eyes. "It's just fish, you idiots." "It could be it," someone joked, throwing their hands up like claws. "Oh, the Erie beast is gonna get you." Most of them laughed. Johnny didn't. Not because he believed in the stories, but because something about them had always bothered him. It wasn't just the lake. It was the people. The way they spoke about it. The way the town acted about it. He'd seen things, growing up in Erie. People who left one night and never came back. Boats that returned empty. The way some of the older fishermen wouldn't look at the water after dark. He never said anything. But he noticed. Still, he didn't want to be the kid who killed the mood. He let it slide. The night stretched on, the fire burned low, and the drinks kept passing hands. At some point, Logan got bored and started daring people to do dumb shit. "Go skinny dipping," he taunted one of the girls. "I'll buy you a six-pack if you do it." She flipped him off but peeled off her tank top anyway, running toward the water with a war cry. Two others followed, shrieking as they dove into the dark. The rest of them watched from the bonfire, laughing. And then, something shifted. Johnny felt it before he saw it. A stillness. A wrongness. The way the air changed, like something massive had just sucked all the oxygen out of it. A ripple, too big for the wind, spread across the water. The girls in the lake didn't notice. Johnny did. He sat up, watching the horizon. Something was out there. Not close. Not yet. But it was coming. He could feel it. It wasn't the usual fear that came from the stories. This was real. Primal. Logan must have felt it too, because his cocky smirk faltered for half a second. He shook it off just as fast. "All right, fun's over, come back in," he called. The girls groaned but started swimming back. And then, just as they reached the shallows, boom! A massive wave slammed against the shore. Not a normal wave. Not one made by wind or boats or anything that should have been in that water. It hit hard, sending the girls sprawling into the sand, knocking over the bonfire, throwing beer cans into the air like confetti. Screams. Chaos. The fire hissed as it met the wet sand, flickering down to embers. And then silence. A deep, heavy silence that made Johnny's skin crawl. Someone fumbled with their phone flashlight. The beam wavered over the lake, casting weak light over the water. And for half a second, a shape. A silhouette, too big to be human, too fast to be anything else. It was watching them. And then it was gone. The lake was still again. But Johnny knew. The hunt had begun. "Guys, book it to the woods." Johnny's voice cut through the stunned silence like a gunshot. For a split second, no one moved. Then the water shifted. A long, curling ripple stretched from the horizon toward the shore. The lake didn't make waves like that. Not on its own. Something was coming. The panic snapped them back to life. Logan grabbed one of the girls by the arm, yanking her to her feet. "Move." The bonfire was half drowned in the wet sand, throwing up thick, choking smoke as the embers fought to stay alive. Someone tripped over a cooler, cursing as they scrambled back up. Then, the first scream. A sharp, ragged wail from one of the girls who had been in the water. She was staring at her leg, at something wrapped around her ankle, something slick and black, like a tendril made of living shadow. It pulled. She hit the sand hard, her nails digging into the wet ground as she tried to claw herself away. Johnny moved before he could think. He launched himself at her, grabbing her wrists and yanking with everything he had. She screamed again, this time in terror as she felt her body being dragged backward. "Help me!" Logan was there in an instant, grabbing Johnny's waist and pulling them both away in one massive, desperate jerk. The thing let go. It disappeared into the water as fast as it had come. The girl scrambled back, her breath hitching, tears cutting streaks through the sand on her face. "Go," Johnny panted, adrenaline spiking through his veins. "Go." And then they ran. The trees loomed ahead, dark and jagged against the night sky. The woods weren't safe, nothing was safe, but they were better than the shoreline. Better than being near the water. The sand made running hell. Johnny's feet sank with every step, his lungs burning, his heart hammering in his ribs. The others were ahead of him, stronger, taller, faster, but he didn't care. He just had to make it. Had to make it to the trees. Behind him, the waves crashed violently, the sound growing closer. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was hunting. Something massive moved just beneath the surface, fast enough that it sent another unnatural wave slamming into the beach, swallowing the last flickers of their dying bonfire. Johnny didn't dare look back. He knew what happened to people who looked back. The first kid hit the tree line, disappearing into the black. Another. Then another. The group tripped and stumbled through the underbrush, branches slashing at their arms, roots trying to drag them down. Johnny was nearly there, just a few feet, just a little more. A hand shot out from the sand, inches from his ankle. Not a human hand. The fingers were too long, too thin. The skin glistened like something not meant for the air. He jumped. He hit the tree line hard, his shoulder slamming into rough bark as he dove forward. Then, the silence. No more crashing waves. No more screaming wind. The lake had gone still. Too still. The kind of stillness that made Johnny's stomach curl in on itself. They weren't safe. Not yet. Not ever. The forest should have felt safe. It should have been a sanctuary, a shield against the thing in the water. But it wasn't. Somewhere deeper in the woods, away from Johnny and the others, another part of the group was running blind. 4 of them, Logan, Sarah, Mike, and Aaron, had split off in the chaos, tearing through the underbrush in desperate panic. The branches clawed at their arms, thorns ripping their legs open with every stumbling step. They didn't know where they were going. They just knew they had to go. "We need to stop," Sarah gasped, her chest heaving, but Logan didn't slow. "No, we don't." His voice was sharp, panicked. We stop, we're dead. You saw what that thing? Drip. The sound cut him off. They all heard it. Drip. Water. But it wasn't rain. The trees weren't thick enough for rain to collect in the leaves, and the sky was clear. Yet the sound kept coming. Drip. 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 Cold. The air shifted from the sticky heat of summer to something wrong. Their breath turned visible in the darkness, curling into the air like mist. Sarah shivered violently. Why is it so cold? No one answered. Because none of them knew. Mike looked down. His sneakers were wet. A puddle had formed beneath him, spreading in all directions, dark and glistening against the dirt. The ground was freezing. A sickening dread coiled in his stomach. Guys, he whispered, barely daring to move. We need to. A gust of wind howled through the trees. Except it wasn't wind. It was water. A wave of something unseen crashed through the branches, spraying them all with ice-cold droplets. The temperature plunged. Sarah let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She wasn't breathing right, her lungs stuttered like she had been thrown into a frozen lake. Logan's hands trembled, his fingers stiff and numb. The cold was unnatural. It wasn't just air, it was inside them, sinking into their bones, stealing the warmth straight from their blood. Erin staggered backward. Something's wrong, she choked. Something's. She stopped. Her face twisted. Her breath stopped. Mike turned to look at her. And his stomach dropped. Erin's eyes were wide, frozen mid-panic. Her lips had turned blue. Actual ice was spreading across her skin in jagged lines, crawling up her arms, blooming across her neck. She reached out, tried to move, tried to scream, but her fingers cracked like shattered glass. Then she froze solid. A grotesque statue, standing stiff in the moonlight, her expression locked in permanent terror. The others stared, horrified. Sarah made a sound, something wet, and strangled, her hands flying to her mouth. Logan backed away. No, no, no. The ice spread out from Erin's feet, creeping toward them, curling through the dirt like roots made of death. Mike grabbed Sarah's wrist. Run. They didn't argue. They ran. And behind them, the ice kept spreading. And the water kept dripping. Johnny moved fast. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. The others were somewhere behind him, or ahead of him, he didn't know. It didn't matter. He just had to keep moving. The woods stretched endless in every direction, branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the night sky. The wind had died. No crickets, no owls, nothing but the sound of his own footsteps crunching against the dirt. Then he saw it. A figure, just ahead, standing perfectly still. He almost called out. almost ran toward them, thinking it was one of the others. Then the moonlight shifted. His breath hitched in his throat. It wasn't someone standing there. It was a body. Frozen solid. Johnny skidded to a stop, stumbling forward as his legs suddenly refused to work right. It was a girl. Erin. Her face was locked in terror, mouth slightly open, eyes wide, but completely lifeless. Her hair, her clothes, everything was coated in thick, jagged ice, as if she had been flash frozen where she stood. The ice had swallowed her limbs, crawled up her throat, seized her hands in stiff, brittle angles. Johnny stared, his own breath curling in the cold air. His skin prickled. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. Ice like this wasn't just winter. It wasn't frost. It was something else. And then, slowly, he heard it. A soft dripping. Not from the trees. Not from the sky. From above him. Johnny didn't look up. He refused to look up. Because he already knew something was there. Watching. Waiting. And just like the lake, it was hunting. Despite the ice, despite the horror curling around his ribs like a vice, despite the frozen body standing there like a grotesque statue. Johnny grinned. The fear was still there. It clawed at his spine, made his heart slam against his ribs, turned his breath to short, rapid bursts. But under all of it, beneath the cold sweat on his skin, there was something else. Something raw. Something alive. A thrill. The same kind of rush he felt when he bolted through back alleys just before the cops could grab him. The same jolt of adrenaline he got stealing from corner stores just to see if he could. The feeling that he had spent his whole life chasing. Most people would be frozen like the girl in front of him. But not Johnny. His fingers curled into fists, his knuckles white. Something big was in these woods. Something unnatural. Something real. And if there was one thing Johnny Vanduke hated, it was being stuck in a world where nothing happened. Tonight, something was happening. His breath evened out, the fear dulling just enough to let his brain work. He should run. That was the logical choice. The smart choice. The choice anyone else in his situation would have made. But instead, Johnny stepped closer. He crouched slightly, shifting his weight on the balls of his feet, his hands ready. He wasn't stupid, he wasn't about to touch the frozen corpse, but he wasn't about to look away either. The dripping sound was steady now. It was moving. Not random. Not rain. Something above. Something big enough to be leaking. Johnny grinned wider, his teeth bared in something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite excitement. He wanted to see it. He wanted to know what was stalking them. He wanted the thrill to last just a little longer. So, ignoring every instinct screaming at him, every warning his gut tried to give, Johnny Vanduke tilted his head. And he looked up. And for the first time in his life, he regretted it. It was there. Not in the trees. Above them. A hulking, dripping mass of something half hidden in the darkness, its shape shifting and undulating like liquid flesh. The moonlight caught just enough of it to make Johnny's stomach churn. Jagged, half-formed limbs, slick black skin stretched over something wrong. And the eyes. Too many eyes. Some human-like. Others slitted like a serpent's. Some cloudy, empty, like they had belonged to someone else before being ripped free and repurposed. They blinked out of sync, each one fixed on him. It was watching. It knew him now. It knew his name. Johnny should have screamed. Should have run. Should have felt the weight of everything he was seeing crash down on him like a tidal wave. But instead, he laughed. A short, breathless chuckle, barely more than a rasp, but it was real. His lips curled into a smirk. He tilted his head, still crouched, still wired with adrenaline, and muttered, "Goddamn, you're one ugly motherfucker." The thing shifted. The dripping stopped. For a second, just a second, Johnny swore it was thinking. Processing. Like it hadn't expected that response. Then, the cold deepened. Ice spread from the trees, crackling outward, covering the ground beneath his feet. Johnny moved. He threw himself back just as a massive limb came crashing down, splintering the frozen ground where he had been standing not even a heartbeat ago. He landed hard, rolling, the air knocked from his lungs. The thrill was still there. But now it was real. Now it was life or death. And Johnny Vanduke had never felt more alive. Johnny's heart slammed in his chest, but not in fear. Not entirely. The ice spread around him, jagged and alive, but his focus wasn't on that anymore. It was on this. On now. He had lived for thrills his whole life. Jumping rooftop to rooftop on the south side of Lancaster, just to see if he could make the gap. Stealing video games from stores, just to see if he could get away with it. Taking punches in fights he never had to start, just to prove he could take them. Breaking into abandoned places, creeping through forgotten tunnels, dodging security, chasing the kind of rush that made his blood sing. But this was it. The ultimate rush. The possibility of death. A real, true thing, not some cop chasing him down an alley, not some pissed off store clerk grabbing his collar. Something big. Something impossible. Something not human. He was staring down death itself. And he was laughing. The beast above him moved, shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its skin gleamed in the moonlight, slick and unnatural, twitching like it was deciding what to do with him. Johnny was still grinning. Not out of arrogance. Not out of stupidity. Out of exhilaration. This wasn't Lancaster. This wasn't some bullshit cop chasing him out of an alley. This was something new. And he loved it. "Man, ugly," Johnny taunted, rolling to his feet, his sneakers skidding against the frost-covered ground. He was vibrating with adrenaline, grinning like a lunatic. "That the best you got?" The thing didn't hesitate this time. It lunged. Johnny barely dodged. He moved fast, faster than he ever had, twisting his body just in time as a massive, dripping limb slammed down beside him, sending cracks through the ice-covered dirt. Holy shit, holy shit, holy shit. He hit the ground, rolled, his body reacting before his brain could. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was moving. Something inside him, some deep part of him, wanted to see how far he could take this. How long he could last. How fast he could go. And goddamn, he had never felt more alive. Another thud closer. This time Johnny turned, dove between two trees, using the terrain like he had used the rooftops of Lancaster, dodging, twisting, pushing himself harder than he ever had before. The creature didn't stop. Didn't tire. Didn't let up for a second. Johnny felt something deep in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. He was good. But for the first time in his life, he was starting to wonder. Was he good enough? The night blurred into motion. Johnny moved like he had never moved before, ducking, weaving, vaulting over fallen logs, skidding down slopes, barely avoiding the thing as it lunged, as it tore through the forest with an unnatural hunger. The ice chased him. It spread in jagged fractures wherever the thing touched, creeping up the trees, curling around the roots. The air was freezing, every breath sharp and bitter, but Johnny's body was on fire, burning with adrenaline, with the sheer electric rush of the moment. He should have been scared. He should have been running for his life. And yet, his blood sang. His heart hammered, but it wasn't just panic, it was excitement. Every time he dodged, every time he slipped just past the monster's reach, he felt a high unlike anything he had ever known. This wasn't stealing a game from the mall. This wasn't hopping fences to escape cops. This was real. This was life or death. And he was winning. Or was he? Because something gnawed at the edges of his mind. Something wrong. He and the beast weaving through the woods, locked in this deadly dance. It felt like a chase. But something deep inside him whispered. Who's chasing who? The thought unsettled him more than the monster itself. Because the more he ran, the more he dodged, the more he twisted through the trees and felt it moving behind him, the more he realized. It wasn't getting tired. It wasn't angry. It wasn't rushing. It was playing. Just like he was. Johnny's grin faltered for the first time. His legs burned. His chest heaved. But the thing wasn't slowing down. It was hurting him, leading him somewhere. And deep down, in the pit of his stomach, Johnny knew something was about to happen. Something big. And for the first time that night, he wasn't sure if he was going to make it out. Johnny's feet pounded against the frozen ground, but his mind was racing even faster. This wasn't just hunting. It wasn't just chasing him to kill him. If it wanted him dead, it could have ended this already. He wasn't stupid. He had spent his life knowing when to run and when to fight, when to push his luck and when to bail. But this wasn't a normal hunt. And then, suddenly, as he leaped over a fallen tree, as ice crawled up the bark beside him, as the thing moved just behind him, he understood. A beast hunts for two reasons: food or population control. And the only reason an intelligent predator indulges in population control is fear. Johnny sucked in a sharp breath, his fingers tightening into fists even as he ran. This thing, this ancient, impossible thing, wasn't killing just to kill. It was killing because it was afraid. Of what? Of who? Johnny wasn't the smartest kid in the world, but he knew one thing. A lion doesn't fear a rabbit. A shark doesn't fear a fish. For something like this to be afraid, that meant humans, people, had something in them worth fearing. And the moment that thought hit him, the moment it clicked, something inside him twisted. Then déjà vu. A feeling that shouldn't have been there. A feeling that he had done this before. That he had been here, in this moment, this place, this chase. But that was impossible. He wasn't crazy. He knew what his life had been. A street kid. A thief. A thrill seeker. Nothing more. And yet, something inside him remembered. Not in his head. Not in his memories. But in his bones. In his soul. Johnny stopped. Dead in his tracks. He stood there, facing it, no longer running, no longer dodging. He let the frost creep up his leg, curling around his ankle, creeping higher, solidifying like it had done to the others. But he didn't feel it. Not the cold. Not the pain. Nothing. The beast recoiled. It lunged its tendrils, its claws, its abyssal limbs reaching for him, trying to take him like it had taken so many before. The ice climbed higher, trying to claim him, trying to freeze him solid. But it melted, hissed, evaporated into mist the moment it touched his skin. The beast let out a sound, not a roar, not a growl, but something deeper, something almost like fear. Because Johnny wasn't freezing. Johnny wasn't dying. Johnny was changing. It was like his body suddenly understood something that his mind hadn't caught up to yet. A pull. A surge. A realization. Something woke up inside of him. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't some sudden jolt of power like the comic books talked about. It was a remembering. a force, a will, a strength that had always been there, deep down, waiting. Waiting for this moment. Waiting for him to be ready. Johnny looked at his hands, his fingertips trembled, his skin burned hot even as the ice crawled higher. Then, with nothing but a thought, the ice melted away completely. The thing reeled back. It knew. It knew what was happening. And Johnny knew it too. His body felt light. Strong. Like he had spent his entire life in chains, and only now were they being broken. His blood boiled, his pulse thundered, and when he took a step forward, the frozen ground beneath him cracked like glass. The beast trembled. It had hunted him. It had tested him. And now, it was afraid of him. The world shifted. Johnny saw. Not like before. Not with the weak, human eyes he had been given at birth. No, now, he saw everything. The night? It wasn't night anymore. The shadows that had once swallowed the woods whole were now clear, as if bathed in daylight. Every branch, every leaf, every ripple in the frozen ground, he saw it all. Felt it all. Knowledge poured into his mind, raw and impossible. Things he should not have known. Things that made no sense. The truth of the night. The monsters that lurked beyond human sight. The things that hunted while the world slept. And this thing, this massive, ancient thing in front of him. It wasn't alone. It was just one of many. Johnny's grin stretched wide, something feral burning behind his eyes as the weight of the revelation hit him. So you're not the only monster out there. His voice came out strong, no fear, no hesitation. The thing twitched, recoiling at the sound of his words, at the power lacing his voice. You're not the only thing that stalks the night. The knowledge in his head burned like fire, illuminating things he had never questioned before: why the town of Erie never grew, why the lake was a constant source of death, why certain places in the world were just wrong. Monsters. Not just this one. Not just the thing in the water. There were more. And now, he knew them. He saw them. And they couldn't hide anymore. His breath came steady, controlled. No more panting, no more exhaustion. His heart hammered not in fear, but in focus. And as he stared down the creature, the first monster to ever try to take his life, he clenched his fists and let the power rise. Well, I got news for you. He took a step forward, the ground beneath him cracking under the sheer force of his presence. The ice that had once frozen him vanished in a cloud of mist. The cold didn't touch him anymore. For what you've done to my friends. The thing twisted, its many eyes blinking in erratic terror, sensing the shift in power. It wasn't hunting anymore. It wasn't in control anymore. For all the innocent blood you've spilled. The beast lurched, as if trying to escape, but Johnny could feel it was too late. The hunter had become the hunted. He cracked his knuckles, feeling the raw, untamed force flowing through his body, through his very soul. A slow, dangerous smirk crossed his lips. "This will be your final night on Earth." The thing let out a screech, loud enough to shake the trees. Johnny charged. The world exploded into motion. Johnny didn't hesitate. His legs moved faster than they ever had before, faster than should have been possible. The distance between him and the monster? Gone in an instant. The beast barely had time to react. 1 second, it was towering over him, a writhing, chaotic mass of tendrils and shifting flesh. The next, Johnny slammed into it like a freight train. It wasn't just a hit. It was a full-force football tackle, all of his newfound strength compressed into one devastating burst of power. His shoulder collided with the creature's core, the impact booming like a gunshot, sending shock waves through the frozen forest. The thing flew backward, straight through a tree. The ancient trunk snapped like a toothpick, splintering into shards of wood and ice, crashing to the ground as Johnny drove the creature through it. They hit the dirt hard, rolling, thrashing, crashing through the underbrush like two forces of nature colliding at full speed. The beast screeched, its grotesque limbs flailing, striking out blindly as Johnny stayed on top of it, his hands gripping, tearing, pushing, his instincts taking over. The fight was on. And this time, Johnny wasn't the prey. The monster lashed out, a long, jagged tendril whipping toward his face, but Johnny saw it coming before it even moved. Everything was slower now, not to the world, but to him. His reflexes were beyond human now, beyond anything he had ever known. He ducked, rolled off the beast as the strike came down, tearing a deep trench into the ground where he had just been standing. He flipped, landing light on his feet, his breath steady, his muscles vibrating with power. The creature rose, its form shifting, twisting, trying to reclaim its dominance. But Johnny grinned. The rush was back. The thrill was real. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was meant to do. He charged again. Johnny swung. His fist connected with the beast's shifting, grotesque form, and the impact shook the air itself. It wasn't like hitting a person. It wasn't like throwing a punch in some back alley fight in Lancaster. This was raw power. This was war. The monster reeled from the force of the blow, its body rippling as if trying to reform, trying to absorb the damage. Johnny didn't give it the chance. He moved faster than thought, his body reacting before his mind could even process it. Another punch, harder this time, slammed into the beast's midsection, sending cracks through its slimy, blackened flesh. It shrieked, lurching back, its many eyes blinking in rapid, panic succession. Johnny just grinned wider. Then he hit it again. And again. Each punch sent shockwaves through the forest, shaking the ground beneath them, rattling the trees like a storm was passing through. The beast tried to strike back. One of its twisted limbs lashed toward him, sharp and unnatural, aiming for his throat. But Johnny was too fast. He ducked, pivoted, and drove his fist into its skull. The hit landed with a wet, sickening crunch, and for the first time, the monster stumbled. It felt that one. Johnny felt something new rise in his chest, something deeper than thrill, something more than just the rush. It was going to die. And for the first time in its existence, it knew it. Johnny grabbed the beast by one of its malformed limbs, spun it with a strength that no human should have had. And then he hurled it straight into a tree. The trunk exploded on impact, shattered into 1,000 splinters as the monster screeched in agony. Johnny cracked his knuckles. His eyes burned in the dark. His breath steamed like smoke. And his grin stretched wide as he walked forward. "Not so scary now, huh?" he muttered, rolling his shoulders, ready to end it. The beast writhed, clawing at the dirt, trying to reform, trying to crawl away. Johnny felt it before he understood it. The power. The knowledge. The history of the Vandukes, his history, all of it flooding into his head at once. It wasn't just a power-up. It wasn't just a mutation or some random accident that turned him into something more. It was who he was always meant to be. The Vandukes weren't just some random bloodline. They weren't just fighters or warriors. They were something bigger. And now, he was one of them. His instincts sharpened, the multiversal knowledge settled into his mind like it had always been there. He knew things that shouldn't be real. He saw other versions of himself, fighting across 4 multiversal wars, standing against gods and monsters alike. He saw history itself, all of human history in every timeline, every branch, every alternate possibility. And it all belonged to him. The beast trembled. It felt the change. It knew it was too late. Johnny smirked, holding out his hand. And from nothing, a .44 Magnum materialized into his grip. Not just any gun. This was something else entirely. The barrel shimmered with raw, unfiltered multiversal energy. The steel was too solid, too real. It looked like it didn't belong to this reality alone, like it had been forged from every version of existence at once. The weight of it settled into his palm like it had always been there. He spun it once, feeling the energy crackle through him, through the gun, through everything. "I might be new at this," Johnny muttered, cocking the hammer with a wicked grin. "But I must say, I quite like it." The beast screeched, trying to pull itself away, trying to reform, trying to escape. But it was over. Johnny leveled the barrel straight between the thing's shifting, trembling eyes. "So, other timelines," he continued. "Other versions of me? 4 multiversal wars." The gun burned in his hand, humming with power, vibrating as the bullet chamber glowed bright. He let out a slow breath. "All of human history," he whispered, his smirk stretching. In every timeline, the beast froze. Johnny's grip tightened. And then, he pulled the trigger. The shot erupted, a deafening blast that split the night in two. Not just a gunshot, something bigger. The moment the bullet hit, the multiversal energy detonated, sending a shockwave through the entire forest. The trees bent outward. The frozen ground shattered into dust. The beast. It didn't just die. It erased. Its body splintered apart, breaking into 1,000 fragments of nothing, like reality itself had rejected its existence. 1 second it was there. The next, gone. Silence fell. Johnny exhaled slowly, lowering the smoking barrel of the gun, watching as the energy faded from the air. The first of many victories. He spun the magnum once, flipping it back into its holster. Or rather, back into nothingness. He didn't need a holster. It would be there when he needed it. Always. Johnny Vanduke smiled. He tilted his head to the dark, empty forest around him. And in a voice that carried through the void of night, he called out, "Tell me, nightmares, are you afraid of the dark yet?" And somewhere, in the shadows beyond the trees, something else was listening. Johnny stood in the silent aftermath, his breath slow, controlled. The beast was gone, erased from existence, but its damage remained. The frost-covered forest was eerily still, the ice melting away as if it had never been there at all. The night returned to what it once was: dark, quiet, empty. But he wasn't alone. Not really. He turned, his new vision cutting through the shadows with ease. The bodies lay where they had fallen, frozen, lifeless. His friends. The ones he couldn't save. Logan. Aaron. Sarah. Mike. The others who never made it out. Johnny clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as the weight of it settled in his chest. The thrill of the fight, the rush of power, it had felt good. But this was real. This was death. And for all his new power, all the knowledge that now burned in his mind, he couldn't change this. With a slow inhale, he knelt beside the nearest body. Erin's face was still locked in fear, her frozen expression forever capturing the moment she had been taken. Johnny swallowed, gripping his shaking hands into fists. He had to do this. Not because it would change anything, but because it was right. One by one, he carried them. His strength made it easier than it should have been. Their bodies weighed nothing to him now, but the weight inside him, that was heavier than anything he could lift. He didn't look away. Didn't let himself turn from their faces, from what had happened. Because this was his first real lesson. Power didn't mean he won every time. It didn't mean he could save everyone. But it did mean something. It meant he had a responsibility now. The graves weren't perfect, just freshly dug earth, simple, unmarked. But they would rest here, beneath the same sky they had laughed under just hours before. By the time he was finished, the sun was starting to creep over the horizon. The deep purple of night faded into an eerie blue, stretching across the remains of the battlefield. Johnny stood over the graves, his expression unreadable. He had no prayers to give, no words to say. So he simply placed a hand over his chest, his fingers brushing against the still fading warmth of his power, and whispered, "I'll make it count." And with that, Johnny Vanduke turned his back on the past and walked toward the future.